And welcome, my name is Margie Bott, and I am the Education Policy Coordinator at the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, or INEE. Thank you so much for joining us today for a webinar on recent findings from 2 mapping exercises related to measuring academic learning and psychosocial support and social emotional learning in education and emergency contexts. We appreciate your participation and hope that you and your family are safe and well during these challenging times. Before we get started, please mute your microphone and turn off your video to minimize any background noise. Please feel free to post any questions you have throughout the webinar in the chat function on Zoom. And please note that this session is being recorded. A recording of the webinar will be made available on the INEE website after it's completed. The webinar will take 75 minutes. And following introductions of presenters in INEE, we will share the purpose of this work. Next, you will hear a presentation highlighting the findings from a mapping exercise on measurement of psychosocial support and social emotional learning, or PSS and SEL. The presenter will then answer any questions you may have. Please type your questions in the chat function, as we will not be able to accommodate questions via audio during this webinar. Next, you will hear a presentation highlighting the findings from a mapping exercise conducted in a similar vein on measurement of academic learning. We will once again pause for your questions for the presenter, and at this time you may also ask any general questions about the project that we can answer. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can, but if we run out of time, we will capture your questions from the chat box and answer them at a later time. Finally, we will share our plans for next steps in our work related to measurement and learning outcomes within INEE. So I'm very happy to introduce you to our brilliant presenters today. First of all, you'll hear from Gerhard Pulfer, who is a manager at the global level for education and displacement at Porticus Foundation, and also represents Porticus within INEE's Education Policy Working Group. Before shifting into his current position in Porticus, Gerhard managed Porticus's program in the Middle East and set up an education emergencies program around the Syrian refugee crisis in Jordan and Lebanon. Gerhard has accumulated many years of experience in aid coordination and governance in conflict-affected and fragile settings, and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Vienna. Gerhard co-led the INEE Equality and Equitable Learning Outcomes work stream, which is the project that this mapping was commissioned from. Next, you will hear from Rebecca Bailey and Stephanie Jones. Stephanie Jones is the Gerald S. Lesser Professor in Child Development and Education and the Director of the ESEL Lab at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her research, anchored in prevention science, focuses on the effects of poverty and exposure to violence on social, emotional, and behavioral development, from early childhood through early adolescence. Over the past 10 years, her work has centered on evaluation research, addressing the impact of preschool and elementary level social emotional learning interventions on behavioral and academic outcomes and classroom practices, as well as new curriculum development, implementation, and testing. Stephanie and her team, including Becca at ESEL Lab, conducted the mapping exercise for PSS and SEL side of this project. I'd also like to introduce you to Rebecca Bailey, who is the Assistant Director of the ESEL Lab at Harvard Graduate School of Education. She works closely with Stephanie to design and lead the ESEL team's portfolio of research, programmatic, and policy work. Becca's research focuses on 2 areas: the development of executive function, self-regulation, and social emotional skills across early and middle childhood, with an emphasis on understanding how poverty and trauma impact brain development and learning, and the design, implementation, and evaluation of SEL programs and strategies in both the US and international settings. Next, you will hear from Kate Anderson. Kate is the founder of Unbounded Associates, a group of global experts providing technical and strategic support to the education sector. Her work includes advising governments, nonprofit organizations, philanthropic donors, and multilateral organizations on their approaches to global education support. Prior to this, she was an associate fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institute, where her leadership on the Learning Metrics Task Force contributed to the inclusion of learning indicators in the Sustainable Development Goals. She has published numerous reports, peer-reviewed journal articles, and has been interviewed on BBC World News. She has a BA in psychology from Pepperdine University and a master's of public policy from Georgetown University. Kate and her team at Unbounded Associates conducted the mapping exercise for academic learning for this project. So very wonderful and brilliant presenters we have today. We're very lucky to have them here. Before I hand over the floor to them to present, I'd like to share a brief overview of INEE, the interagency network that has made this work possible. INEE was conceptualized in year 2000 at the World Economic Forum in Dakar, where UNHCR, UNESCO, and UNICEF took forward Strategy 5 of the Dakar Framework for Action and convened the first global consultation of education in emergencies. It's been 20 years now, and INEE has over 16,000 individual members, 130 partner organizations across 190 countries. INEE members are practitioners working for national and international NGOs and UN agencies, Ministry of Education, and other government personnel, donors, students, teachers, researchers, just about anybody who's working in the education emergency space who voluntarily join in the work related to education and emergencies. INEE exists because of our members, and we all have the same goal in mind, which is to enable quality, safe, and relevant education for all in emergencies and crisis contexts throughout the prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery phases. We are underpinned by the philosophy of collective impact, that we can make greater progress towards our shared goals together. Working in an interagency forum means that we can come together through a collaborative and iterative process to impact greater change in the education emergency sector. Besides individual members, INEE also comprises of organizational membership through our working groups. There are currently 3 working groups active: advocacy, standards and practice, and education policy. The work we will share with you today is the priority of the quality and equitable learning outcomes work stream within the education policy working group. I would now like to welcome Gerhard Pulfer, who is the co-convener of the group, to share more about the group's makeup and priority areas of work. Gerhard?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Margie. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, good. So the quality and equitable learning outcomes workstream started out as a small donor group comprising USAID, AFD, and us as Porticus. And over time, it got much more broader and much more diverse, as you can see at this slide. Next, please. As an objective, we would like to support quality education in the sense of evidence-based approaches. We strongly believe that the measurement of learning outcomes is indispensable in this context. And when we talk about learning outcomes, we mean more than academic learning. We have the holistic development of the child in mind, with a particular emphasis on social and emotional learning and psychosocial support. And in the second half of 2020, we would then like to present a policy paper to promote measurement of learning outcomes. Next, please. So the mappings that Harvard ESEL and Unbounded Associates will present shortly are an important milestone towards this policy paper that we envision. As firstly, these mappings identify existing measurement tools and approaches for learning outcomes at the program and country level, and they relate them to relevant regional and global frameworks, such as SDG 4. Secondly, they also help us to understand how quality education in emergencies is actually defined through the skills and competencies that get measured. Thanks a lot.
Hi, My name is Rebecca Bailey, and I'm here presenting for the EASL lab today, and Stephanie Jones is also on the line and can help take questions. Next slide, please. So we're going to do a very quick overview of our methods and approach to the SEL and PSS mapping exercise, and then we'll focus on some of our key findings and implications. Next slide. So the broad goal here was to identify and to analyze and describe the existing social emotional learning and psychosocial support measurement and assessment tools, as well as the role of SEL and PSS within the guidance documents being used in the international education and emergencies sector. Next slide. And the purpose for us, in addition to what Gerhard mentioned, is to really better understand and document how measurement tools that are currently in use, how they represent what skills and competencies are identified from guidance documents and from the body of existing research, and also how they are used to both monitor programs, inform our understanding of program impacts, and feedback into the body of research. So in thinking what gets assessed, gets targeted, as well as gets understood in the literature, we really want to understand what are measurement and assessment tools currently assessing. Next slide. So measurement is really, we really see it as this critical link for the entire field of education and emergencies, both informing programmatic work, programmatic improvements, and our understanding of global monitoring and global goals. Next slide. So our research questions start with how, where, and with whom are SEL and PSS tools used. So really trying to understand what tools exist and where and how they're being used. Second question is which SEL competencies are priorities currently within the field of education and emergencies? Which features of children's context, background, and experience are being considered and captured in these SEL and PSS tools? What considerations or barriers exist for including crisis and conflict affected populations in the SEL and PSS tools? So in other words, how well are education and emergencies really considered within the existing tools? And how are the SEL and PSS tools aligned to the existing global guidance documents? And how well equipped is the field to monitor progress towards these global goals? Next slide, thank you. So we had 5 main phases, and you can read a lot more about each of these and our methodology for each within the report. But just to summarize, we started with desk research and contacting about 35 key stakeholders that work in the field of education and emergencies. We conducted an INEE survey, or we sent a survey to the INEE membership to understand which SEL and PSS tools they were using and how. We conducted interviews with key stakeholders and also drew from a bank of 40 interviews with that we had previously conducted in a study of SEL in international contexts. And those interviews are really what we're going to draw on to share findings about the considerations and the challenges related to adapting, contextualizing, and validating measurement tools for education emergencies. We conducted coding, which was really geared at looking at what skills or competencies are targeted by the different measurement tools, as well as by the guidance documents, and identifying points of alignment or gaps or priority areas. And then analysis, which included some of those cross-tool comparisons and mapping analyses to look across the tools and the guidance documents, as well as analyzing key features and producing profiles, summary tables, and other materials that are within the report that allow stakeholders to really look deeply into the tools and understand what SEL competencies are included. Next slide. So here's a list of the guidance documents that ended up in our final analyses. There are 24 guidance documents, and you'll see many that are familiar to you. Next slide. And this is a list of the measurement and assessment tools that were included in our final analyses. There are 35 tools in total. Next slide. And the programmatic approaches that we reviewed come from 6 different organizations. Next slide. So before I get into the findings, I'll just say that there is a lot of detailed information about all 3 categories of materials that we looked at that's within the report. So please feel free to look through the report, and we hope that the profiles and the other detailed information will be helpful for you. So now I'll focus on our key findings. In terms of global coverage of the SEL and PSS tools, we found that the United States has the highest number of tools in use, and the country with the second highest number of tools is Turkey. And in contrast, the African continent has the fewest SEL and PSS tools currently in use. Next slide. In terms of tool validation, we found that a very small number of SEL and PSS tools have been adapted or validated for education and emergency contexts, and that the validation strategies that are used for tools are different across each tool and really range from quite simple translation of items to more deeper contextualization discussions with local stakeholders. So there's many different validation methods in use, but these really vary by tool, and it's important to kind of know what methods have been used for the tool that you're interested in using. And in general, measures were validated either by their developers or by outside researchers. Next slide. In terms of what SEL competencies are prioritized within the field, when looking at the global guidance documents, what we see is that all 6 of the main areas of SEL, what we call domains, this would include cognitive domain, emotion domain, social domain, values domain, perspectives domain, and identity domain. All 6 of these are targeted, but as you can see in the bar graph, different domains are targeted to different extent. Overall, guidance documents and measurement tools tend to emphasize 4 of these 6 domains: the cognitive, the emotion, the social, and the values domains. Next slide. However, when you look within the guidance documents, you see that each one has a different profile of emphasis, meaning each guidance document places different weight on different domains, and in some cases, some domains are omitted or much more heavily emphasized. So you can see to the figure on the right, the variation that exists in the field. So again, this is the guidance documents. And what you see is that the social domain is the only SEL domain that's included in all 24 of the guidance documents we coded. So this may suggest that social skills are important for children in crisis-affected contexts. We know they're important for all children, but they're clearly appearing the most frequent across guidance documents that currently exist, and other domains are appearing less frequently depending on which guidance document or which organization produced it. Next slide. And so for example, some of the differences that we see are in the GPE results framework, only 3 SEL domains are included. And for example, those are different than the 3 that are included in the SDGs. We see that in the INEE minimum standards, all 6 domains are included. There's particular emphasis on both social and values domain. And in the INEE psychosocial support guidance note, we see all 6 domains included, but with the greatest emphasis on emotion and identity. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does highlight that there's quite a lot of variability in how the field is defining and prioritizing SEL competencies for the education and emergencies sector. Next slide. In terms of the measurement tools, we see a quite similar pattern as in the guidance documents. So the tools tend to focus heavily or exclusively on 4 of those 6 domains: the cognitive, emotion, social, and values. Next slide. But you see that a large number of those measurement tools do not include skills across all 6 domains, and therefore wouldn't really be appropriate to use if you were trying to capture skills across all those relevant areas. So for example, the emotion regulation questionnaire includes skills only in the emotion domain. The GRIT scale includes skills only in the cognitive and values domain. The Melco model direct assessment includes only cognitive and, sorry, I can't actually see my slide for a moment, and emotion domains. So the thing to note here is that we actually see greater variability in the measurement and assessment tools that exist compared to the global guidance documents. Next slide. In terms of capturing features of the environment and what we call equity and ecology codes, what we see is that we really looked at 5 major factors: ecology, meaning features of the environment; equity, meaning how well different genders, children with different disabilities are included and described and considered in the tools; health, meaning basic health and safety; and adult teacher support. So these are the 5 factors we looked at, and what we see is that across the guidance documents, all 5 contextual factors were applied, meaning were considered within the guidance documents, with the greatest focus on ecology, equity, health, and safety. Next slide. And within the measurement and assessment tools, what we see is that ecology and equity codes were applied the most frequently, meaning those were the most captured or described within the measurement and assessment tools. Next slide. In terms of the programmatic approaches that we reviewed, we see that the 6 programmatic approaches each include all 6 domains. And, or excuse me, across all of them, all 6 domains are included, and 4 of the 5 contextual factor codes were included. And that equity, ecology, and adult support were the ones that were most represented across all 6 programmatic approaches. So we think that this suggests that programs place particular emphasis on the contextual features when developing SEL PSS interventions. Next slide. In terms of the considerations of this mapping exercise for education and emergencies, a number of themes came up, particularly in our interviews and conversations with key stakeholders working in education emergencies. So the number one concern or consideration is to do no harm. And many stakeholders talked about the need to be particularly sensitive to the needs and experiences of children affected by conflict and crisis, and that this can pose a barrier to ethically measuring SEL and PSS in education emergency contexts. So for example, the specific items in a measure, the length of the measure, or even the act of being assessed and the environment of assessment could be acceptable for children in stable contexts, but may pose the risk of re-traumatizing children and causing harm in the midst of a crisis and conflict. And that this is a particular consideration and a need for measures that have been designed with this consideration in mind. Next slide. In terms of validation, very few studies were showed SEL and PSS tools to be validated in crisis and conflict settings. So in a majority of the situations, we heard stakeholders using tools that had not yet been validated for these specific populations or contexts, and that when validation had happened, it was often conducted with varying levels of quality. And I think this is a really important piece to call out, because we know that accurate measures are so important to really make sure that our resources and time that are being committed to education and emergencies are really used effectively and efficiently. And so we really want to call this out as a opportunity for growth for the field, and a real need to have more tools that have been validated specifically for emergency contexts. Next slide. The role of contextualization was mentioned by many stakeholders as a major barrier because it requires such significant funding, resources, and time, and is not often something that is well supported by existing grants or projects. So the idea is that this is something that we need more support for in the field in order to do good work. And when local adaptation and contextualization is done well, it's often described by stakeholders as a particularly important component of what makes their implementation and measurement of SEL and PSS effective. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of tools designed specifically for use in education emergency contexts, over 90% of the tools in our mapping analysis had been used in conflict and crisis contexts, but only 4 tools were specifically designed for emergency settings. And so those include the HALDO, ISELA, ITELA, and SERE. And these were developed, 3 of them by Save the Children, and the last one, SERE, by NYU Global Ties. Next slide. In terms of drivers of cost, the vast majority of tools included in our analysis are free, but there are underlying costs of using them in conflict-affected contexts. So these include the piloting, so training and consultant fees, as well as numerator costs, as well as the administration of the tool, depending on the mode of the tool. Scoring costs if external scoring is required, and then translation and adaptation. And these are fairly time-intensive endeavors, so the costs here, even when the tool itself is free, can be quite high in terms of really adapting and getting ready for use in international emergency contexts. Next slide, please. In terms of the progress and gaps in relation to the field capacity to monitor progress towards global goals. Next slide. The main areas of progress that we identified are first that major stakeholders really are aligning around SEL and PSS as a global priority for all children, including those in conflict and crisis affected settings. And what I mean here is that we really do see that across the guidance documents in particular, that there is a strong emphasis on SEL and PSS, and that is something that there is agreement and consensus that it is a key feature to be included and considered in education and emergencies. Second, that there is an emerging, oh, sorry, can you go back? Thank you. That there is an emerging sense that children and youth in conflict-affected settings have unique needs and unique circumstances that should influence those SEL and PSS goals. And third, that global goals recognize the importance of contextual factors for education and emergencies. So many global guidance documents do highlight important factors relevant to education and emergencies, such as equity and environmental factors and safety, which impact policy and practice. Next slide. In terms of the gaps we identified or opportunities for future work, Despite the kind of emerging consensus that SEL and PSS really matters, there is not a common definition for SEL or PSS that underlies all of the global goals. And as we saw across the guidance documents, there's quite variability. There's quite a lot of variability in what specific competencies or factors are included in the different global guidance documents. When measuring SEL and PSS outcomes, education in emergencies is not often captured. So what we mean here is that the vast majority of the SEL and PSS measurement tools were not designed for use in education and emergencies, and therefore don't specifically capture those features. And only 4 of the tools we looked at were specifically created and designed for education and emergency settings. There is a lack of measurement and assessment tools for contextual factors in education emergency settings. And what we mean here is that although many of those contextual factors like equity and ecology were captured within the guidance documents and are indeed included in programmatic approaches, that they are often missing from the measurement tools. So although we're saying that they're important to target and many of our programs are actively working to target them, they are often not being captured in our monitoring and evaluation efforts. And finally, that there's a lack of measurement and assessment tools for SEL and PSS at the population level. So there are quite few international or national level assessment tools for SEL and PSS. The majority of the tools we found are really driven by researchers and used in programs or in evaluations and not at the national or ministry level. Next slide. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I'll invite Stephanie to jump in too.
So, hi everyone, this is Stephanie. Thank you, Becca, that was super great. Very clear. I thought that while you read the chat, Becca, I could answer some of the questions in it because I've been reading it.
That sounds great.
And then you can answer the ones that I feel like I don't remember the answers to. So, so there were a bunch of questions about how the tools were selected. So what are the inclusion criteria? Did we consider who's using the tools? Are the tools designed for all ages? Are they just tools that were available in English? And so on. And I would just point you, for expediency's sake, to page 33 of the report, which kind of goes into detail, but not too much, very readable, detail on the methods. We did have inclusion criteria for the tools, and it's described in a list. Most of the tools were, I should say that the tools covered a developmental range from early childhood to elementary and primary to secondary, but most of them were really situated in the primary years. In the coding, we took into account, Becca can correct me if I'm wrong about this, the sort of who the tool is intended for, who's supposed to be using this tool for what purpose. How it made it into our synthesis and analysis is not completely, it's not exactly, I don't totally remember, but the report has so much detail in it that if you want more information about that, you can absolutely read the profiles for the different tools. So there were also questions about the indicators that we used to coding, and that's a much longer conversation. We don't probably have time for that particular conversation today, but I will say that the coding system that we applied to all of these different documents comes out of a history of work that Becca and I have been doing together in the broad field of SEL, and is represented in some detail in a website called Explore SEL, where we've applied the coding system that we used here, most of it, to frameworks that are used around the world to characterize, describe, and define the big domain of SEL. And you can see in our methodology in that website, but also in this report, the specific codes that are used in each of the categories that Becca was talking about. There is a real question about there was a really important question in the chat about like, whose perspective on the skills gets included? Does it all just come out of academic research, or do providers, those who are actually using the material, those who are doing the tools on the ground, are their perspectives included? And that's a real tension in the field. We both want to represent skills and competencies in a way that is consistent with evidence and research about human development, about these domains, but we also want to capture and represent the values and ways of thinking that people on the ground bring to this work. And so that's a real tension that we've faced in our lab that we're trying to address in different projects, but is always around. And so it's something to just be aware of, and maybe, just maybe, a source of some of the discrepancy between the coverage in guidance documents and the coverage in programmatic approaches in terms of like the domains that are covered, which is something to be reconciled. It's an important gap because the gap itself could lead us to misunderstand the effectiveness of the things that we're doing on the ground. So I'll stop talking there. Becca, do you want to add?
No, that is great. I do want to just emphasize that the report is really large. There's a lot of details and we couldn't cover in the amount of time. So questions about what age groups are targeted by different measures, who the measures are designed to be used in terms of administration by teachers or researchers, parents, information about what languages the tools are available in, certainly the details on validation and psychometrics and contextualization processes, and including contact info for each of the tools and tool developers and cost info. All of that information is included in detailed files for each tool. And there's also, in terms of the questions about indicators for how the competencies were identified and coded across the tools, guidance documents, etc. I think what you're looking for there is really how do we apply a coding system to capture the SEL domains, and our coding system is included in the appendix of the report, so you can really see at a fine level of detail how did we determine, based on a particular item in a measurement, a tool, how do we determine what skill it's targeting. So the report may be a bit overwhelming, but there is a lot of detail, a lot of information embedded in it.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Becca. I think that was most of the questions. A lot of the questions, as you said, will be answered in the report itself. I did want to mention that within INEE there is a new source available that's specifically for measurement of psychosocial support and social emotional work. It's called the MENAT Measurement Library. Sarah, if you can link to the library here on the chat function, that would be great. This is a tool where you can go on the INEE website, go to the library page, and you will be given a set of questions about what type of measurement work you would like to do in terms of measuring PSS and SEL, whether it's at the project level, program level, individual student level, and the library will guide you to the available resources. The library also shares the extent to which each of the resources, the measurement tools, have been validated. And so you can see what kind of criteria went into the validation process within that measurement library as well on the website. So I hope that's helpful. And now I'd like to hand it over to Kate to lead us in a conversation about academic learning outcomes and the types of measurement and assessment tools that we mapped for that work.
Thank you so much, Margie, and thanks, Stephanie and Rebecca. That was a tough act to follow, but I will do my best. And I'm joined by Lindsay Reed and Elena Losada, who are my co-authors and really have a lot of expertise in the actual coding exercise here. So they'll be jumping in to answer questions. And we're just very grateful for this opportunity. So if you could go to the next slide. I'll only touch briefly on the methodology because we did coordinate quite a bit with the EISL team and kind of align our methodologies, although there were some things that we did differently given just kind of the landscape for academic tools and frameworks versus PSS and SEL. So I'll mostly touch on some of the differences, and the full methodology is in the report. Then we'll talk about the measurement tools, the guidance documents, and the program approaches that we looked at just briefly before going into kind of what we saw as far as the academic domains that were included in these tools, especially around the measurement tools, and then a summary and some conclusions. So next slide. Next slide, the background and methodology. So just really keeping in mind what the key challenges are to measuring learning in emergencies. So there are a variety of challenges to measuring learning at all in any context, and also in low and middle income countries have a separate set of issues. So we really tried to zero in on the challenges unique to the humanitarian sector. So first, that existing assessment systems used at maybe a national or subnational level are not necessarily set up to capture populations on the move. For example, if they're collecting data in schools and a school closes or the school population moves to a temporary learning space, the systems can't necessarily capture the learning outcomes of the learners. We found in several reports of the regional assessments and early grade learning assessments that that when a school was closed or there was a conflict or disaster in a certain area, those schools and children were excluded from the study going forward. And so that tends to be something that continuing education in general being a challenge, but continuing collecting information about children's learning is also. Another issue is the parallel systems of education that exist, one for displaced or refugee children and one for children in the host country population. So that can add to the confusion over who's responsible for measuring and ensuring learning. National governments are kind of in general unable to fulfill the need to measure learning, and so being thrown into a conflict or crisis situation makes that even more difficult. In some extreme cases, there's situations where the host country, both the host country and the country of origin, don't allow their curricula to be used with refugee children, for example, in Bangladesh. So that adds another layer of complexity. If the curriculum is not determined, then determining what to assess also becomes difficult. And then this was mentioned quite a bit by our EISL colleagues, but just the cognitive loads that are faced by children in conflict and crisis can kind of give them somewhat of a disadvantage when taking a standardized test. So we need to be very aware of those. Next slide. So for our methodology, we looked at 31 measurement tools. That included 23 distinct approaches, and then a group of 8 citizen-led assessments comprising the remaining tools. And again, all of the detail about these assessment tools are in the report, so I encourage you to look there. We're just going to be kind of touching on some of the broader findings today. We looked at 8 guidance documents, and this is where we're a little bit different from the PSS and SEL in that almost all of the 31 measurement tools also had their own guidance documents, and they were pretty similar in terms of what was being measured. So we kind of included those within the measurement tools, and we looked at guidance documents that were kind of broader frameworks for that governments typically, contributed to the design of and adherence to. So say sustainable development goals, GPE, results frameworks, regional documents guiding education systems, and then considered kind of the rest of the guidance tools that were more at a programmatic level within the measurement tools and the program approaches. So there were some key factors for selection. You can go back. Sorry. Just I know that this was asked in the previous Q&A. So the criteria were that they address literacy and or numeracy learning outcomes, that they're used in at least one country where education and emergencies is provided. So not necessarily that the tools and frameworks were used for the EIE population, but that in a country where there was a conflict or crisis. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the country selections. We were looking at education levels from pre-primary through lower secondary. So the ISCED levels 0 to 2. And we were looking at assessments that have been used in at least one full cycle assessment process, from design to collection, analysis, and dissemination. And there were some emerging tools that we learned about through this process, which were very exciting, but we were not able to include them just given the amount that we had already identified that had been through the whole process. We had to be able to access the tools and encode them. Reliability and validity was not a criterion for inclusion, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We also had the benefit of using a framework encoding scheme created by UNESCO IBE and the UIS to map the content domains and subcategories in math and reading. So we were, and because of that, and they had done a mapping of around 50 countries, we didn't feel the need to look at individual national level assessments and assessment frameworks because it had already been done, and we were able to use what had been done there. Next slide. So for the conflict or crisis affected countries, we identified 61 countries. We combined the UNHCR Refugee Situations List, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs Operations List, and then we brought this to the INEE working group members and asked them if there were any other situations where they would be interested that were not on the 2 lists, but where there was a conflict or crisis, and they felt that there might be something interesting to capture. So this is how we identified the 61 countries. They're all listed in the report. And again, this is not, you know, a master list of EIE countries, but it's for the purposes of this paper. Next slide. So as far as the measurement tools, we looked at cross-national tools that were used in more than one country. Of the 61 countries, only 2, Eritrea and Libya, did not participate in any of these cross-national tools. And again, we used the IBE and UIS data to cover the national assessments. You can go to the next slide, and that shows the kind of coverage by age and grade level. So some tools use grade levels, some use ages, but you can see kind of a broad swath all the way through secondary of tools that we looked at. And all of these acronyms are in the report. Some are very familiar to some of you, and some not so much. So please do check out the report for more information. Next slide. Okay. So we found that there was a variety of ways that the tools were administered. Some of them, there were oral assessments, especially for the younger children, some in the household, some in a school or community center, depending on the tool or purpose. The assessments for older children, the regional assessments, PISA for development, tools like that are typically paper-based or computer-based with multiple choice and open response questions. Next. Next. So we also looked at what information is being collected on the context. So all of them include some sort of information on basic characteristics of the children and their families. Some look at the learning opportunities outside of school, household characteristics, characteristics of the school and community. some of the regional assessments and the early grade reading assessments often incorporate background questionnaires. This is not necessarily in every administration, but they're sometimes optional tools that are administered alongside the learning assessments. Notably, that information about refugee or IDP status is not collected with the tools. So there's only kind of a recent effort, and this is for good reason in many cases, to avoid stigmatization, but it also really prevents us from knowing to what extent these tools that are used at a national or subnational level are actually capturing the learning of children affected by crisis and conflict. And there's some recent efforts to gain consensus on how to collect statistics on refugees and IDPs, but it was emerging at the time of writing this. Next. So validity and reliability there's quite a range. All of the measurement tools have been designed and piloted to determine some sort of psychometric standards of validity and reliability. In some cases, it was as simple as face validity. So does this, according to other research and tools, does this seem to be a good measure? Some have gone to very, especially the tools that are designed to be comparable across countries, have much more sophisticated levels of establishing reliability and validity. 3 tools were designed specifically for education and emergency settings. Save the Children's HALDO, the UNRWA, MLA, and EDC's out-of-school youth literacy assessment. There were others, as mentioned in the previous presentation, that were designed for developing context in general and were piloted in emergency settings as well. But out of the 31, we only found 3 that were specifically designed for EiE contexts. Next. So these are just, we had a couple of vignettes, and this came out of the survey that we did with INEE members. We got some great stories about how assessments were being used. And so you can read about 2 of them in there. One is the War Stressor Survey that was conducted in Syria. So they did the early grade reading and math assessments, and then administered also the War Stressor Survey to get contextual information. There's also a story in there about the Onofita Community School in Greece, and how they use classroom assessments to monitor learning for children there. So just to, kind of supplement the data that we looked at with a couple stories of how this is applied in real life settings. As far as the cost, this was something that was also, we could generalize about it. There's a lot of tools that are open source and available online, but as Rebecca said, there's costs associated with in-country administration. The regional assessments and a few of the international assessments require countries to pay a participation fee. And those tend to be on a sliding scale. So OECD countries, for example, which were not a focus of this, tend to be in the range of $250,000 US for the cycle of administration. And then for the regional assessments, most of the people that we've talked to said that it kind of depended on the ability and willingness to pay of the governments. The test administration represents about half of the total cost. And then the institutional costs for the personnel that are running it is around 25%. Next. Okay, for the guidance documents, next slide. Here's the guidance documents that we looked at. So we looked at SDG 4, the SDG 4 and Education 2030, which are an aligned kind of set of global goals. The INEE minimum standards, the Agenda 2063 by the African Union, the Life Skills and Citizenship Education in the Middle East framework by UNICEF, the Pacific Regional Education Framework, the GPE Results Framework, and Education Cannot Wait. Next. So we really found that there was not a lot of specificity in any of these global frameworks on what specifically to measure. So most of them mentioned learning outcomes or even literacy and numeracy, like the SDGs. But as the SDGs were agreed in 2015, they don't provide common definitions or constructs of minimum proficiencies. That work has been taken forward by the UIS, the custodian of those indicators, and they have agreed now on minimum proficiency standards for reading and numeracy for grades 2 to 6. So this was a big step forward in kind of coming up with common guidance. There's still no global tool, and nor do most people think there should be, to measure literacy and numeracy kind of the same way in every country. What the UIS has really tried to do is say, you know, if you participate in an international or regional assessment that meets our criteria, then you can use that data. If you have a national assessment that meets these standards, that can be used, and really kind of putting the onus on the experts and the psychometricians to align the results rather than on the governments to align their measures. So this, you know, with the SDGs kind of being the overall guidance document, a lot of the other guidance documents for specific regions or specific types of settings kind of defer to this as the global guidance. Next. We did look into several regional frameworks, and again, they do refer to SDG 4. All of the frameworks highlight the importance of disaggregating by a variety of child and family level factors. But again, disaggregating by refugee or IDP status is not part of that. Next. Okay. And then again, looking at the INEE minimum standards, they don't recommend, require, or align to any specific assessment tools. And that flexibility, you know, we think is good, because there's a lot of other kind of groups out there, including UIS, that are putting forth these kind of global recommendations. Next. Okay, as far as the program approaches, next slide, we looked at 4 examples from many program approaches that look at strengthening learning and equity in conflict-affected settings by Save the Children, World Vision, EDC, and UNRWA. Next. We go into more detail in the report and describe these, but basically they tend to take a existing tool that's maybe been validated in multiple countries and then tweak it a little bit to align with their program goals, and then in some cases do a validation study with the kind of modified tool. These interventions tend to use the tools to show evidence of improvements in academic outcomes by having kind of this aligned approach. And sometimes they supplement them with contextual surveys about the student background and school context. Next. So here's where the next section is where we looked at what is actually included in these assessment tools. Particularly, as we mentioned, the guidance documents did not go into the level of detail we needed to code, so we only looked at the measurement tools for this academic domain mapping. Next slide. So we adopted, again, the UNESCO, IBE, and UIS set of content domains. So in literacy, it had to do with reading, linguistic, and metalinguistic competencies. And then we added writing, which was not originally part of the framework. In math, math proficiency, things around problem solving, number knowledge, measurement, statistics, geometry, and algebra. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see kind of where the coverage is. So this looks at the categories of tools, and we have this information for all of the tools individually, but we kind of wanted to cluster them to look and see what the trends were. So for the kind of international assessments, comprehension seems to be something covered in all of the tools, with some of the kind of higher order skills. Regional assessments, again, around comprehension, but also levels of vocabulary and phonological awareness. The household surveys and some of the foundational skills and early childhood surveys look at more kind of precursor skills like decoding, and not so much into comprehension. So it's quite a kind of broad range of what the tools cover, but most of them cover either decoding, comprehension, or both. Next slide. So this is, basically what we just described. One thing to note is that kind of the beginner tasks, such as decoding, are more frequently found in assessments of early childhood and early grades, and more complex tasks found more frequently in assessment of higher grades. And this makes perfect sense in a system where 100% of children enter school on time and progress on time. But in situations when that's not the case, when we have a lot of children out of school and coming to school late, or disruptions in education, it's possible that some of the tools might not catch the entire range of their abilities, if only kind of sticking to that more traditional model. Next. So for mathematics, it's very clear here that number knowledge, including operations like adding and subtracting, is covered in every assessment. But some of the other areas like problem solving and reasoning, measurement, statistics, geometry, algebra, are much less captured, mostly in the international assessments, which the coverage in low and middle income countries in general is just less than some of the other types. So the higher order skills are not necessarily being included. Next slide. And none of the tools cover all of the subdomains, and that would, again, for the reasons described, that we have, giving one test with all the domains to a child would probably be overwhelming. So, and some of the more advanced content are very sparse, but it also seems to be that really the focus is on number knowledge and things like simple operations. And the regional international assessments do have a greater breadth of domains. Next slide. So in summary, next slide. We found that the majority of learning assessments, again, do not look at whether a child taking the assessment is a refugee or IDP, and that is both a positive in that it kind of reduces stigmatization, but also doesn't allow us to really know the true state of learning outcomes for children affected by conflict and crisis. And many learning assessments don't construct a sample to ensure the inclusion of refugees and IDPs. And in some cases, we found that they actually exclude them from the studies many times for the safety of the administrators of the assessments, for the, to make sure that there's less attrition in the study, because it's more likely that children on the move are not going to be able to be captured in the next iteration of the administration. So a variety of reasons that make sense to the people running the projects from a research side, but from our perspective of being able to capture the state of learning, it really puts us at a disadvantage. Most of the learning assessment studies are conducted in school, with some in homes. So children in camps and other informal settlements who are not in school are unlikely to be included in a study unless they've been resettled into a home and enrolled in a government school. And even if they are enrolled in government schools, they're sometimes excluded from assessments when the assessments are conducted in the national language, and the other kind of issues that relate to assessment in low and middle income countries more generally. Next. So, I mean, overall, it's challenging, right? So we're not trying to kind of criticize any of the studies and the researchers that are collecting information on children's learning. Just taking an assessment that was used in one context and using it in another, it doesn't necessarily work. So there needs to be resources going into adapting not just the tools themselves, which I think is where a lot of the effort is placed, but actually just adapting the entire approach and mindset to assessment. We know that by getting more information and data on learning, there's a potential to increase equity for children, but by and large, it's not being done currently. And I mean, the great thing is that there are quite a bit of assessments in a variety of languages out there being used by national governments. So translating those into conflict-affected and fragile contexts, it requires effort, but there's something to build on. There was kind of no real guidance on what the specific domains should be that we should be measuring in these countries. So that's also something that, and I know there's future work on a policy brief noted, but that I think will be useful to kind of take a look at this and what the ESEL team has done to see, you know, what makes sense to be measured in EiE contexts. And knowing that there's some common domains that can be built upon based on what's already available. So that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was great and super interesting, and really interesting to hear the findings from the academic side of the mapping following the PSS and SEL. There were a couple of questions that I believe Lindsay answered in the chat function already. If others have questions for Kate and her team or in general about the project, please feel free to continue to add them to the chat function and we'll be sure to address them. For now,
you wanted to, sorry, Lindsay, were there any questions that you wanted to answer? I liked how Rebecca and Stephanie kind of traded off at the end. So Lindsay, anything that you wanted to answer?
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, definitely. So we actually didn't get that many questions in the chat, which is either a sign of an excellent, very thorough presentation, or perhaps people are stunned by the amount of information that we're trying to relay today. And I will echo what our other team mentioned earlier, is that it might seem overwhelming, but we are very willing to answer questions, or if people want to follow up later after having a chance to read through the report, I'm very happy to share my email and information if people want to reach out and discuss further.
Great. Thanks. There was one other question I see on here around whether any of the instruments included guidance for administrators on recognizing when an outcome may be the effect of a cognitive processing or reading disorder versus just a delay in this skill development. I didn't come across any guidance like that, but I think it would be worth another look. I don't know, Lindsay, if that came up in any of your coding around.
No, I don't recall seeing very much detail on this point.
And given, I mean, this would be really excellent to look into, but we were looking mostly at the content of the tools, given the scope of the exercise, and we didn't do coding of the administration manuals, which would have been a great exercise as well. We did look in and kind of, when we had specific questions that came up from the working group members, we tried to dig a little deeper. In some cases, those manuals are such living documents that that they're not published online, and they kind of, you know, have even kind of, you know, different versions are used in different countries and language groups, and they proliferated to the extent that it would be hard to capture, but it's a great question. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay and Kate. So in terms of next steps, as you mentioned, Kate, we have a policy paper in mind. I'd like to hand off to Gerhard to tell us a little bit more about the next steps.
Thanks, Margie. Can you click on the next slide, please? Great, thanks. So thanks to both teams for the great presentation. And on the basis of this mapping, or these mappings, the team of consultants has been identified to take the work forward and to develop a policy paper. So this team will work closely with the QELO work stream, as well as with other INEE work streams. And the policy paper basically aims to provide guidance, particularly for donors in the sector. The underlying assumption here is that the sector is heavily donor funded, and donor policies accordingly will make a difference at the field level. So the policy paper is expected to help strengthen measurement of holistic learning outcomes, both in humanitarian as well as in protracted crisis. And we expect the policy paper to promote a shift towards access plus learning outcomes, to provide also messaging around quality, what quality learning means in the humanitarian sectors, as well as in the development sector, so across the humanitarian development nexus. The policy paper is also expected to discuss the policy barriers and opportunities, as well as potential technical issues that education providers might be confronted with when it comes to outcome assessment at the field level, and also to discuss the cost of measurement as well as the cost of not measuring, so the cost of inaction. And lastly, the policy paper will also try to provide guidance on what is specific to measuring learning outcomes in crisis context or emergency situations versus regular education contexts. And in terms of time frame, we are still waiting for the inception report to outline a detailed time frame. But overall, I mean, some basic dates are that we expect the inception report to be available well before the upcoming INEE meeting in May, mid-May. And we hope to present the policy paper either around the time of the UNGA, whatever shape and form that will take, or at the upcoming INEE meeting in fall 2020.
Thank you, Gerhard. There's one more question that's emerged for Kate, Lindsay, and Becca. Maybe you can address this in both of your papers. It says, in the conclusion, you mentioned that IDPs and refugees are excluded. What about stateless persons and refugees? I didn't hear you mention them in the whole presentation. Would you like to talk about how the inclusion of stateless persons was mentioned in the report, Lindsay and Becca?
This is Kate, and we unfortunately, I think this was an oversight on our part for the sake of brevity. We also did not find any references to collecting data on stateless status or as far as any of the assessment tools looking specifically at persons who are stateless. And for the sake of brevity, I think we said refugees/IDPs, but would include that, and we probably should not have just included that together, and in the report should have separated it out, and that's an oversight.
Becca, did you want to add anything from the PSS SEL report side?
Sure. I mean, I don't have anything different to add, meaning there's not, there really wasn't much information captured about these populations across the tools that we reviewed. So I think this is a major area of limited information.
Yeah, thanks both. And a good point here in the chat function. How could IDPs, refugees, stateless be included in such studies without comprising their safety, identity, and/or without compromising attrition, but still get that information? And an important and general question for us EiE practitioners to think about. Yes, absolutely. Gerhard, there's a question for you. Would there be an opportunity for education providers to input into this policy paper?
Yes, I mean, it depends. Of course, I mean, if people are in the INEE and in the work streams, and if there are other ways, I don't know, depends on how INEE would like to organize this process. But for anyone engaged in the work streams that are earmarked for this policy paper, definitely. And for outside, I don't know, we have to see what kind of consultation process we want to arrange. But I would be open to that opportunity, certainly, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be great if you're interested in the policy paper, or if you have any additional questions about the mapping exercises, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be sure to get you engaged and involved in the work that we're doing. So in the interest of time, I just wanted to quickly say thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you so much, Gerhard, Stephanie, Becca, Lindsay, and Kate, for all of your contributions and excellent presentations. We hope that the participants, you found this webinar to be informative. Please reach out to us if you have any additional questions, and please take a look at the reports themselves and share widely within your networks. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Margie. Bye-bye.